is here first. Juggling lessons. Looking forward to that trip with you in Vegas. 1,000 Pine Points to you. I just got back from icy cold Canada. That's why I haven't produced any content for the last 5 days? 6 days? Feels like a long time. So I watched this video of Braxton Hunter critiquing or just giving his impressions, responses to another Canadian, Paul. And I thought I would go through this. I just made some notes, but I purposely made the title the way I did because what's fascinating to me about apologists like Braxton Hunter is that he wants the resurrection to seem reasonable. He wants the evidence to be reasonable for a man rising from the dead. He is trying to convince others that there's this place called heaven and there's a place called hell, and this is really important stuff. And that if you don't confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and take up your cross and follow him, that you're going to suffer. He does believe in this bad place called hell where people suffer for eternity, I think. At least last time I talked to him, he did. I think he said the traditional view of hell was the most important. So there's a lot at stake here. But he's trying to make this whole resurrection hypothesis that the resurrection actually happened and that explains, it has explanatory power and explanatory scope. He's trying to get the world to see this and say, look, we have all these good reasons and all this good evidence to believe this, yet his own text says this is foolishness. I don't get it. Where's the power of the Holy Spirit involved in all this? To open your eyes and take the scales off so we can see the truth. Doesn't it say in the New Testament that it's the Holy Spirit that guides to all truth? Christians listening out here, they're nodding their head. Amen, Doug. Preach it, brother. What is with all these evidentialists? Come on. Of course they're not going to believe a man rose from the dead just because an old book says so, unless they got the special sauce, the power of the Holy Spirit. By the way, do you like it I'm on the other side today? Versus, I switched things up. Because I noticed Braxton, I'm not going to go there. So I know people think it's disrespectful if I speed people up on these, but I don't want to. I'll try skipping through some of it, so this video is not too long. But if I'm having fun, I'm just going to keep going, because this is about me having fun. Adam asked, did you see T-Jump on versus Caption Christianity on Modern versus C? No, I haven't. I haven't seen that. I've been gone for a week. I've seen a little bit of stuff, but my dad turned 80 years old, and so I flew back. I actually drove to Vegas, then flew back to Manitoba and celebrated with my aunts and uncles and dad and family. It was great time. Okay, here we go.
Down this alternative hypothesis. In the words of my co-host Jonathan Pritchett, every time an atheist tries to present an alternative hypothesis to the resurrection, it gets shredded by Christian apologists.
Whenever a non-Christian presents an alternative hypothesis, it gets shredded by apologists. That's probably true. It probably does get shredded because we're perishing, Like I could say, well, most of the Gospels and even the epistles are mostly fiction. It's a story. It's a story to tell a greater truth. I could say something like that and leave it like that, but no, it would get shredded. By the way, my advice when talking to apologists like Braxton Hunter is give them everything they want. It doesn't bother me, really, because at the end, when I bring up things like the flying man, like everything that Braxton Hunter might say in this video, we could apply to my flying man thought experiment. And I tell you, they're not going to believe in the flying man based on that evidence for 1 second.
Now, I would never do any shredding or anything like that because, after all, if I did, it would be courteous shredding. I actually think a lot of Paulogia. I really like Paulogia as a person. I know I say that all the time, but I've actually had real conversations, virtual conversations with Paulogia and real conversations with Shannon Q. And so,
yeah, I wonder why you haven't had a real conversation with Paulogia or myself. I think we're about the same size channel. Actually, I'm double U, and Pelagia is like 10 times your size. Maybe that's why you don't talk to Pelagia, because he's too big. I don't know.
So these are interesting people. I think they are smart. I think they do the best they can to create a compelling channel. And I don't think they just go running headlong into these things slinging insults. I think they think through what they're going to say. And that makes...
Unlike Judas, Pelagia doesn't run headlong.
for a more interesting video, and I think this is going to be a good one. So I don't want to spend too much time jawing about this, so let's just jump right in and see what Pelagia has to say. Let's go.
When presenting the case that Jesus rose from the dead, the Christian will often point to a set of historical facts which generally boil down to Jesus was crucified, people claimed he rose from the dead, and now the church exists. Now would an
Okay, now let's break that down a little bit more.
I know from personal experience, when you summarize a Christian's position, in their mind thinking, straw man, no, you got to be nuanced. You got to have all the details. Otherwise, it's a straw man.
Because he says it basically does that. I know what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, look, if you collapse everything they're saying down and truncate it all, it comes to basically these three things. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I think there's at least one thing that's really important. So he says Jesus was crucified. Well, Jesus died by crucifixion. There was an empty tomb. Jesus had presented himself as God's special eschatological agent. These are all things that are mentioned and are really important to the case. Now, I don't particularly use the empty tomb, although we're going to say some interesting things about Jesus' burial here. So
I wonder why, Braxton, why don't you use the empty tomb? Is it because maybe historians and guys like Habermas have given up using the empty tomb? I think I'm going to bring this up now. This is Rabbi, speaking of Jesus the Rabbi, here's another Rabbi, Tovia Singer. And Tovia Singer, I think, is better than Jesus, at least right now, because he's not dead. Okay, I crossed the line. I take that back. But this is Rabbi Tovia Singer explaining why, from a Jewish perspective, he believes in the same Yahweh form of God as Braxton. He's explaining why people like him reject the empty tomb narrative.
That is such an important...
Oh, and the question is, well, he'll say it.
Important question. Why did the women go to the tomb to bring spices to anoint the body on Sunday morning? So as it turns out, this is a question that no one asks. I've never heard it. It always seems to me to be the elephant in the room because it demonstrates that the story of the empty tomb never happened.
The story of the empty tomb never happened.
And you're going, what? And I need to explain this. We are told in the Gospels, not all the Gospel, we're told, let's just take Mark as an example, the last verse of Mark 15, the first verse of Mark 16, that after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James, Salome, they brought spices to anoint Jesus' body. That was the reason why they went to the tomb Sunday morning. In Luke, we find a very similar story at the end of Luke chapter 23, verse 56. They went home to prepare the spices and perfumes, and then the women rested on the Sabbath in obedience because they kept the law of the Sabbath. You don't prepare spices during Shabbos. And very importantly, on the first day of the week, that means now we're going to Luke 24, verse 1. What do? The women took the spices they prepared, and they went to the tomb. So we have these stories where the body of the crucified Jesus is buried before the Shabbos, and women come to the tomb Sunday morning because we forgot to anoint with the spices.
Okay, now, I bet you a lot of Christians have never even thought of this. Like, why in the heck would they bring spices to a body that's already been decaying for at least a couple days?
You have to put the spices on the dead corpse. Listen very carefully. First of all, if you're a Christian and you're easily offended, you should turn off the show and watch something else.
You know, this is funny to me because I say something similar. I don't say it that often, but I have said before, like, if you're going to be triggered by this, turn it off, click off now. And Tovia says something similar. And he's a theist.
I don't mean to offend, but this is a point that everyone overlooks. This story never happened. It's complete nonsense. And ask yourself this question. Did anyone that you know of in your life, in history, ever go to a tomb 3 days later because some anointment had to be placed on a now rotting corpse? It never happens. Let me provide the background because the idea of having spices with the person who passed away is all over Jewish tradition, and it's important to explain. The moment a person dies, the body immediately is decomposing, immediately.
So he goes on to basically say, you put the spices on the moment the person dies so you don't embarrass the family of the person who's dead. so because they'll start smelling. They didn't have the technology we have today to what they do at funeral homes, mortuaries. So they put spices on right away. And so if you're waiting a day, 2, 3 days later, it's too late. And so there's Rabbi Tovia Singer saying here, look, the whole idea that the women would go to the tomb to put spices on, that was their motivation to go to the tomb in the first place, is silly. And that is a marker, it's a clue that this is a story, this is made up. Okay, I don't know if this is why Braxton Hunter has stopped talking about the empty tomb as, let's say, a minimal fact in history. I think he still believes it. But anyhow, let's go on.
Not a part of my resurrection case, and I don't need it, I don't think, to overcome this. But I do want to say that these other elements are very important. One of those that I mentioned was that Jesus thought of himself as God's special eschatological agent, which means God's special agent to bring about the kingdom. That's going to...
Okay, Jesus thought of himself. We know that because of the Gospels, right? And I guess of Paul's letters. But mostly the Gospels, what we know of what Jesus said about himself. Actually, interestingly enough, does Paul ever quote Jesus? I think maybe he does, but once or twice. Someone can fact check me on that. Does the Apostle Paul even quote Jesus Christ at all? I think it's all in the Gospels. And so what we have of what Jesus says about himself, being special, I'm God's special agent, that comes from the Gospels. Much later.
I'm going to come up in just a few moments, so I'll just put that on the table and let's leave it sitting there for just a moment. People claim that he rose from the dead. Well, there were multiple appearances. The disciples were willing to die for the claim. The creed of the early church demonstrates that within 1 to 3 years after the events, people were claiming that he was dead, buried, and rose again. So does it? Can you truncate it down to something like people claimed that he rose from the dead? Well, yeah, you can, but you need to understand, the pertinent elements, why these people say it and why it's interesting that they say it, especially in light of the fact that they were willing to die for their beliefs. And
I think he goes into this a little bit more, the whole martyrdom thing. So I'm going to hold off on that.
And lastly, now the church exists. Well, you got to take care of the rapid expansion of the early church, the dramatic changes in belief and worship practices. N.T. Wright breaks down 7 of those, the willingness to undergo persecution and so forth. So there's a lot packed into these 3 things that he kind of says it all kind of boils down to these 3.
And interestingly enough, there are what I'll call minimal facts that can be boiled down to a few things in, I think, even Mormonism and Islam, and that we can have a cumulative case in Mormonism and in Islam, and we can have these similar type of arguments.
Let's not get too hung up on that. Let's keep trucking.
Actual resurrection of Jesus explain these facts? I suppose, but a supernatural explanation can be used to explain anything. Did an all-powerful being have a hand in starting my car this morning? It's certainly possible, but it's also...
Why are you shaking your head, Braxton Hunter? Did you guys see that? Watch Braxton's head here.
Will being have a hand in starting my car this morning? It's certainly possible, but it's also possible that when I turned the...
I bet you a lot of pine points that there are Christians here today who have prayed that their car will start in the morning. And especially when they first turn the key and it goes... And then they make that, I got to get to work. I got to do this. I got to do this. Please, God, make this car start. And just like in Back to the Future, they hit the steering wheel and maybe it starts. I don't know.
The key, a mechanical process, drew air and fuel into the cylinders. A spark was ignited, combusting the system to begin the engine revving. We can't rule out that God started my car, but his involvement isn't necessary to explain my running car.
Okay, so this is where it's important to talk about the fact that Jesus thought of himself as God's special eschatological agent, was going around preaching things that are important about God and the one true God of Israel and who he was and all these kind of things, because it means that, unlike your car apologia, this message, this event, has a religiously informed theater. That means that there's already religiously significant trappings all around this thing.
This is just fascinating to me. There's my favorite word, fascinating. This is really interesting to me that there's a religious theater. This is not just a car. We're talking about Jesus here. He's special. Now, isn't there like this religious context and theater surrounding Muhammad? Isn't there this religious context and theater surrounding Joseph Smith? Joseph Smith claims to have talked to Jesus, seen Jesus.
There are no religiously informed trappings around your car. As I've said many times before, when Jesus presented himself as the Son of Man and presented himself as God's special eschatological agent, which, by the way, universally the scholarship accepts. There's always outliers, but universally the scholars accept this.
Accept what? That Jesus said that he was God? Is that what you're saying?
Then that means that it was as if he was walking around in his life holding up signs saying, just watch my life and just see what happens. And it was a religiously informed claim. So that means that...
Interestingly enough, the earliest records about Jesus says nothing about Jesus' ministry, him walking around and saying stuff. And that's Paul's letters. Isn't that interesting, Braxton? There's almost... I could be, there might be one or two things, but there's almost, besides the death and resurrection that Paul talks about, I don't think Jesus' ministry is even mentioned in Paul's letters.
He's presenting himself as a certain kind of person. There's a religiously informed theater, as I've said to this. There's nothing like that with your car. Not only that, we do have a very clear awareness of the naturalistic explanations of how...
Apologia, shame on you. Don't compare Jesus to a car because Jesus is special. He claimed to be divine.
Your car, there's nothing miraculous or even seemingly miraculous about how your car works. We know how all of that works. So I think those two things are pretty important. And but he's setting up, I get it, he's setting up to say, well, is there a naturalistic explanation for the events around the resurrection?
Yes, it's a story, mostly.
I just think it's important to notice that this is not really directly analogous to the car situation because of the point about Jesus thinking of himself and preaching about himself.
Paul's point is a very powerful and simple one. The apologia, I should say. I don't want to confuse people with Paul of the New Testament. Apologia's point is a very simple one, that when you have something happen, you could always say the supernatural caused it. You could always say that. It's really hard to defend it and prove it, but you could always say that. But if we have a choice between a naturalistic explanation and a supernatural explanation, and if we value truth, maybe we shouldn't be so fast in saying, oh, there's a supernatural explanation for this.
And that he's the special eschatological agent. All right, so let's keep trucking.
Is there a similar explanation for the existence and history of Christianity?
No.
Please indulge me for a minute and allow me to lay out one possible scenario.
Oh, by the way, Paul, when I'm done, if I ever finish, you're welcome to hop on and we can talk about anything I missed. So take notes, Paul, if you want, while you're listening.
Around 30 AD, the Middle East was littered with apocalyptic preachers, including one Jesus of Nazareth. This Jesus said or did the wrong things at the wrong time to the wrong people and was crucified on a cross. As was a standard Roman practice for the crucified, Jesus' body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside of town.
Okay, now let's stop right there because this is actually pretty interesting. Now, I let him get through with what he was saying there because I didn't want to cut him off, but I want you to notice that he has put, and you really can't see him clearly here, but you can see him. He's put three very interesting citations on the screen in the bottom left-hand corner there. Now, he doesn't quote them verbatim. He doesn't quote them at all, but he does reference them. He puts these citations. But then he has an image up there of Roman soldiers putting dead bodies into a mass unmarked grave. And he says this was the standard practice of the Romans. Well, let's listen again because I want him to be able to say it for himself. Okay.
Standard Roman practice for the crucified.
Okay, the standard Roman practice for the crucified is
Jesus' body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside.
His body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside of town. Now, at the end of the video, when he kind of summarizes everything that he said, he comes back around and he says that it was a mass unmarked grave. So where did he get this idea that it's a mass unmarked grave? Well, I want to put back up again these citations that are at the bottom left-hand side of the screen.
Okay, so Braxton spends, I think, close to 10 minutes talking about this. And I talked to Apologia before I went live, and I asked him about this. And he said that these passages that he gave are related, but are not the best clearly. They talk about the exceptions, and if there aren't exceptions, then there isn't a general rule. And so, but I'm not exactly sure why Braxton Hunter spent so much time on this, because he ends up, I think, agreeing with Paul or other Christians. Let's see if I can find it here. Well, let me play this first. This is a question that Cameron Bertuzzi asked historian Gary Habermas about mass graves and pits and common graves and that sort of thing.
And what is It's another common objection that I see is that most probably Jesus' body would have been thrown into a mass grave. So my question is, what is the earliest historical evidence we have of Jews being thrown, criminals being thrown into a mass grave? Does it come at the time of Nero, around 70 AD, or does it come before then? Because it seems to me like that's the earliest evidence that we have of these mass graves.
Okay, first of all, you're going to be hard put to nail exact historical references when it was done. But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people, not necessarily mass graves, but a little classier would be a rectangular square in the ground, like today, only without a casket. And you put the body on top of it and covered up. That would be kind of a classy one. A mass grave would be, garbage, in a garbage heap or something. But it's a totally moot point.
Okay, it's a totally moot point, but he's admitting that most of the time this is what happened. And he doesn't even distinguish between wartime or peacetime. He basically said, hey, if you got crucified people, they end up in the ground, either in a small rectangular pit or a mass grave or in a garbage pile. I think there's also strong evidence to say that they often were hung up on a cross for a long time and the birds would pick at their flesh. But why does he say it's a moot point? It's a moot point because Braxton Hunter, like Gary Habermas, will say, but Jesus was special because he was a Jew. And another special person who was a Jew, who was with the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, they had certain laws and certain privileges with the Romans, the Jews did. And so Jesus could have gotten and did get a grave like he did, a tomb.
The bones, then put them into a coffin again. So I want to move our attention to the Romans for a minute, but before I do, I want to also point out that if this secondary burial thing is happening even with crucified victims and people who receive other kinds of capital punishment, according to the way that the Mishnah and the Tosefta describe it, then this secondary burial required time for the flesh to rot. So the sources I have say about a year, which means that even if those two places that the court had assigned for those bones to be put into coffins and then placed in these burial areas, even if one wanted to argue that those were mass graves, that was a year after the fact, and they would have to be able to locate the body or the bones of the body in order to move them there. So there would be no problem identifying where Jesus was so that detractors could counter the resurrection claims by saying, look, here are the bones of Jesus.
You know what's interesting? When I first heard Braxton say this, if they knew where the bones were, then they could have found them and said, hey, look, here's the bones of Jesus. I was reminded of this, and I made this as a response to Michael Licona a while back. And it goes like this. John the Baptist had been publicly sentenced to death and buried in Jerusalem. Then his resurrection was proclaimed there publicly by Herod. The body of John the Baptist could have not been in the grave because his followers knew where John the Baptist was buried, yet they couldn't produce the body. Mark, you can read this for yourself, Christians, Mark 6:14-29. So here we have an example of people claiming a resurrection, like Herod, and being wrong about it. And all they had to do was, they knew where John the Baptist was buried. All they had to do was provide the body to show Herod, hey, look, this is not John the Baptist, because here's the bones. But yet they didn't do that. I always find that this is an interesting comparison to use with Jesus. A lot of Christians say all they had to do was provide the body. Well, they didn't do that for John the Baptist. And it shows more clearly, though, that people believed in resurrections back then and were mistaken. Maybe that's the case for Jesus.
So that's very important to mention. Now, if one wanted to say, okay, fine, but the central point still is that the Romans treated the bodies of crucified victims however they wanted to, and people wouldn't really be able to reliably find the bones of Jesus to produce them in such a case because of these mass graves. Whatever you want to say about the citations from the Mishnah and the Tosefta not being Roman, the fact is still that the Romans were known to have this mass burial thing going on. I want to present to you some data from this book that you see on the screen right now, which is written by Craig A. Evans and N.T. Wright, Jesus, the Final Days. What Really Happened. This is a fantastic book. In that book, on this section, Craig Evans writes that victims of Roman crucifixion were normally not buried, but their corpses were left hanging on the cross to be picked apart by birds and animals. That this is the normal Roman practice is not in dispute here.
Yeah, so he's admitting, Craig Evans is admitting that Apologia was right. that it's not in dispute here that that's the typical case. But of course, guys like Braxton Hunter and Gary Habermas and Craig Evans will argue, but this is not the typical case because Jesus is special.
So Craig Evans is actually going to counter a criticism that is brought by people that want to argue that the Romans would have left Jesus' body on the cross. So this is a different objection than what Paul is raising here. So he's actually saying this. People are saying that's the standard normal. What's the wording? For the victims of the Roman crucifixion were normally not buried, but their corpses were left hanging on the cross. And he says people are saying that, but that this is the normal practice is not in dispute here. So this is the normal Roman practice, apparently by his enemies and coming from Evans himself. But he goes on to say, what is questioned here, though, is the assumption on the part of a few scholars that the hundreds, even thousands of Jews crucified and left hanging on crosses outside the walls of Jerusalem during the siege of AD 69 to 70 are indicative of normal practice in Roman Palestine. So you can't go.
Yeah, notice the date between 69 and 70 AD.
Based on that. He's going to tell you why in just a moment. We're going to look at that section. But what I want to say to you right now is if Jesus' body was left on the cross to be eaten by animals, which was the normal Roman practice instead of these mass graves, then everyone could simply observe this happening to Jesus. And so finding his bones, locating his body, mangled as it would not be difficult. And of course, there'd be people standing around saying, no, we saw him get eaten by crows on the cross,
Yeah, see, and here's the problem that I think a lot of Christians have, like Braxton Hunter, that type of Christianity is they just assume that when they're reading the Gospels, they're reading mostly history. And so, well, if they wanted to show that, everybody could have just saw that Jesus was still hanging on the cross. And if this is a story written 30, 40, 50 years after the fact, this is not a thing that they would have thought of. That the Gospels were written at a time when people, and I think Braxton even admits this later on in this video, that the Gospels were written at a time when people started dying off like fleas. And so, and probably, he doesn't say this, but probably 1,000 miles away before it started circulating. And so anyone who could say otherwise and said, oh yeah, I saw Jesus on the cross being picked at by birds, he wasn't put in a tomb, they're long dead and gone.
But let's go further. Let's actually argue that there's reason to believe that he received the burial by Joseph of Arimathea, just as the Bible says. Evans goes on to say, peacetime administration in Palestine appears to have respected Jewish burial sensitivities. Indeed, both Philo and Josephus claim that Roman administration, in fact, did acquiesce to Jewish customs in his appeal to Caesar. Philo draws attention to the Jews who appealed to Pilate to redress the infringement of their traditions caused by the shields and not to disturb the customs which throughout all the preceding ages had been safeguarded without disturbance by kings and by emperors.
Yeah, and I think even Richard Carrier talks about this, that there were special, special rules, special agreements between the Romans and the Jews to do this.
A generation later, Josephus asserts the same thing. The Romans, he says, do not require their subjects to violate their national laws. This is powerful. Now, what people will often do is to try and show that these situations with Josephus and Philo and all those kind of things are the exception. But it's the historical data that we have. So, in looking back...
And the historical data that we have, as we just heard from Habermas, is that most of the time this is what happened to crucified victims.
Back over all of this, what I think would have to be overcome by Paul's hypothesis, the hypothesis would have to overcome if Jesus were buried according to the Mishnah and Tosefta, there would be no problem for detractors to produce the body of Jesus.
Now keep in mind, even according to the New Testament text, the really religious people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they didn't care for Jesus, right? So they wouldn't have any desire to give Jesus a proper burial. But this is why, well, we're going to get there, but this is why a lot of people think that Joseph of Arimathea was invented. He's a fictional character invented within the story. And there's reasons to believe that, even using Psalm, the 53rd Psalm, as a template of where Joseph of Arimathea came from. If you ever talking to a Christian about this and they're just like, they're getting really upset that you would say something like that, just remind them that they could have used the New Testament, the Old Testament, as the template of creating a narrative and creating Joseph of Arimathea, and remind them that Joseph of Arimathea is not a minimal fact. Historians don't, in a majority or in a consensus, agree that Joseph of Arimathea even existed and that he took Jesus off the cross and put him in a tomb.
Also, the normal Roman practice of leaving crucified malefactors on the cross in plain view of detractors, that the evidence provided in the original video does not establish mass burial, that the actual historical evidence we do have mentions a member of the Sanhedrin itself requesting the body of Jesus from the Romans, and that there...
Yes, and that person is Joseph of Arimathea, which enters the scene in the Gospels for the sole purpose of providing a mechanism to get Jesus from the cross into a tomb, and then we never hear from him again. Where do you see that? Where do you see characters entering a scene, exiting a scene, never to be heard from again? We don't see that typically in history. We see that typically in fiction.
There is evidence of the Romans acquiescing to Jewish tradition regarding such burials. So I don't think it establishes what he intends for it to establish. There's all kinds of good reasons to believe that the tomb was empty. I've gone into that elsewhere, but it's not really a part of the case that I present. So I just want to leave it at this, and let's keep trucking.
Body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside of town. This Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable.
Troy in the chat says, interesting that apologists need a guy who isn't a minimal fact to put a body in the tomb in order to have a minimal fact. Oh, 1,000 pine points to Troy. What Troy just said is brilliant in the live stream chat, because all these minimal facts, depending on which apologist you talk to, could be 4 up to 13 or something like that. Troy's pointing out that in order to have these minimal facts, they are built upon hundreds, if not thousands, of other things to even get there. And if you are not confident that you're looking at a reliable text of history, then you can very quickly doubt that there even was a tomb in the first place.
Bible history, never to be heard from again, all except
Now, that we could talk about that, but let's just keep going with it for the sake of brevity.
Simon Peter and possibly John. For a culture without last names, there were a lot of people named John. Devastated after the death of his mentor, Peter may have suffered post-bereavement hallucinatory experience.
Thank you, Ronald Mendonca. Thanks for using Tovia Singer. Jews don't believe in Jesus, so can you explain the whole Judeo-Christian thing to me? Maybe someone can make a video about this. Yeah, maybe.
Or
Okay.
But thank you for the generous donation.
Post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences. Now, there's a couple of things that I want you to notice. First of all, I want you to notice that in the, I'm going to assume that because I think Paulogia is like an illustrator or
Yes.
an animator or something.
Yes.
I'm going to assume that
He used to work for Disney.
he drew these pictures, and they're fabulous.
No, Lucas. Sorry, right, Paul? Lucas.
By the way, Paul, good job. But I want you to notice that Peter debatably looks kind of old here. All right.
Yeah, I talked to Apologia about this earlier, and I think he said that the template for these drawings was from the Roman Catholics. Is that what you said, Paul?
Right? This is not, you would not look at that guy and think that's a young guy, right? That's a little bit important for what we're going to talk about next, because he's telling us that in his hypothesis, Peter suffered from post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences. And we're going to talk about those promptly, but first let's let him throw his data up on the screen.
or PBHE, a well-researched phenomenon documented in papers like these.
Okay, now I want you to notice something on the screen, all right? First of all, I want you to notice, where is it? Let's see. All right, I want you to see here that this one is bereavement among elderly people, grief reactions, post-bereavement hallucinations, and quality of life. Now I want you.
Okay. So Braxton's way of countering the fact that people have these experiences after their loved ones die. People have loved ones die, and if they have no history of mental illness, they can still have these hallucinations, both either auditory, visual, and sometimes both. And that this is actually way more common than you think. But what Braxton's going to talk about here is that this study is mostly for old people.
You look down at the abstract down there. Ratings of grief reactions, post-bereavement hallucinations, and illusions, and quality of life were made during the first year after the death of a spouse among 14 men and 36 women in their early 70s.
Okay, early 70s. What's the average lifespan in the United States right now? Isn't it like mid-70s? So what was the average lifespan 2,000 years ago? Wasn't it mid-40s? So a 70-year-old would be old today. But wouldn't a 40-year-old be old back then?
We're talking about research done on people in their early 70s who are experiencing the death of a spouse. Those are two meaningful distinctions, but we'll only focus on one of them. And the fact.
Yes, but I think it's fair to say that these things happen not only with spouses, but just people you love deeply.
Is that we're
Like Paul and James and Peter, they probably loved Jesus deeply.
We're talking about older people. Now, let's think about the Apostle Peter. Jesus was 30 years old when he began his ministry and continued it for 3 years. So it was typical among Jewish rabbinical tradition that your rabbi would be older than you were. So,
But does it say in the New Testament that Jesus was older than his disciples? Does it actually say that? I'm saying this for a reason that's coming up later. I just like to point out for the record, judge and jury, that it actually doesn't say the ages of Jesus compared to his disciples within the text itself. Just I want to put that on the record.
So it's reasonable to assume that Peter was younger than Jesus.
It's reasonable to assume that Peter was younger than Jesus? Really? Okay. And it's I'm going to use that line later. It's reasonable to assume later on, I think.
Now, how much younger? Well, not too much younger, because we learn later that Peter is married. So you could also do some things with when you think Peter died and going back that way, but he's a relatively young man. The point is he's
relatively a young man if he's how old?
probably under 30. Let's just go ahead and go crazy with it and say he's 40.
Okay, if you're going to grant me 40, I'm going to grant you that Peter was an old man. If it's true that the average lifespan was 45 back then. I think it was somewhere between 40 and 50. Someone can fact check me on that one. But would you not agree, Braxton, that if you're saying Peter was 40, that he's now an old man?
He's still a lot younger than in your early 70s, which is what these
That's
men
true.
and women in this research were, which means that this research isn't really relevant to the Apostle Peter because it's bereavement among elderly people specifically.
But Peter was an elderly person because the average lifespan, he was very close to the end.
Now, in the second paper, Post-Bereavement Hallucinatory Experiences, a critical overview of population and clinical studies, I would have highlighted this fact. A 30 to 60% prevalence emerged from the reviewed literature, giving consistency and legitimacy to the phenomena described. However, though I would have mentioned that fact, you would have to, if you're going to present the whole story, follow that with the statement in the study. However, current data should be cautiously interpreted given the limited number of studies and the many theoretical.
Yes, Franklin, that does include baby deaths. So assuming people lived past the age of 15, I have a paper on that a lot of Christians have looked at and said, no, we spit on that paper. I don't care anymore. I've given up. But yeah, I think the one paper I saw was the average lifespan was 45 or something, and that is already assuming that the person lived to age 15.
Methodological biases. It seems likely from the present review that several heterogeneous entities hidden under one general term confound epidemiological data. So the fact is that there's a lot. I mean,
I talked and I missed some of that. There's something important in here.
if you're going to present the whole story, follow that with the statement in the study. However, current data should be cautiously interpreted given the limited number of studies and the many theoretical methodological biases.
Oh, okay. Let's see how well you guys know PineCreek. What am I thinking right now when Braxton says this?
Follow that with the statement in the study. However, current data should be cautiously interpreted given the limited number of studies and the many theoretical methodological biases.
What am I thinking about? If you answered near-death experience studies, you would be correct. So just like Braxton Hunter saying, oh, we should have exert caution when looking at these studies because they're limited sample size and we have some biases here. Well, I'm going to use that line the next time Habermas mentions NDEs, near-death experiences, because they're even more seldom. The number, if you start with a pool of 100, you're like down to 2 or 3 by the end of near-death experiences that you can examine.
It seems likely from the present review that several heterogeneous entities hidden under one general term confound epidemiological data. So the fact is that there's a lot. I mean, when he speaks about it, and I don't think he's doing this with the intention to deceive, but when Paul speaks about these things, he speaks like this is all well researched. This is all, hey, this is nailed down, and we now know that when someone has this post-bereavement stuff, this is kind of what happens. Well, this is all highly.
Well, we have pretty good evidence that it does happen in a small fraction of cases.
Questionable stuff, and the one that's more specific is the one that's talking about elderly bereaved individuals, and
Yeah, and Peter's granted 40 years old. Peter probably had a walking cane.
not someone the age of Peter. But let's keep going.
With BBHE, a lonely, low mood, fatigued, anxious, bereaved person without history of mental disorder will have an abnormal sensory experience. In
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul.
about a third of the cases, the individuals will report seeing, hearing, and talking to someone deceased. Or
Okay, now let's back up a little bit here. That information that he just gave about these what are called multimodal hallucinatory experiences, where you can talk to someone, you see them and you hear them. That data is from that first study, the one that is about elderly bereaved individuals. Again, that was the only focus there. That they didn't talk. This was not about the general population. So that data is just isn't.
Okay, I'm going to do some street epistemology on Braxton Hunter, and my question to him would be, let's say I provided you a study of the general population, and it showed that, I don't know, 10% of people who lose a loved one will either have auditory, visual, or both, even tactile hallucinations. Would you reject Jesus Christ as your Lord and personal Savior? Would you now say that this is a more naturalistic explanation and the resurrection probably didn't happen, so I will abandon Christianity? I bet you 10,000 Pine Points you would say, no, I would still be a Christian.
Relevant so far as I can tell. Also, I'd like to present some data that I've come upon when preparing for debates on this very issue, that according to the American Psychological Association, a hallucination is a false sensory perception that has the compelling sense of reality despite the absence of an external stimuli, whether auditory, visual, olfactory, or kinesthetic. Multimodal hallucinations are very rare. Multimodal, again, being when you're...
Yeah, they're very rare. And you know, that could explain what happened to Joseph Smith. Don't you think, Braxton? As rare as it is, Joseph Smith could have had some visual, auditory, and maybe even tactile hallucination. As rare as it is, that could have happened, right? Or do you actually think it's more probable that Jesus actually did appear in front of Joseph Smith? Do you think that's more probable?
Experiencing two sensory hallucinatory perceptions at once, like hearing and seeing an individual such that you could talk to them. All right, 15% of the general population will experience one or more types of hallucination. Females more often than men. And so not only is Peter not old, he's also not a female. And the older one is the more likely that they're going to have this. All right, so what we have here are several pieces of data that are all very interesting that come together to help us understand why this sort of thing.
So let's say you said 15%. Let's cut that in half down to 7 to account for the fact that Peter was a man and maybe to account for he was young. Is 7% more probable than a resurrection? What percentage of the population rise from the dead?
Probably,
But Jesus was special, right?
isn't the case with Peter. Now, let's go a bit further. There is an article from 2014 called Visual Hallucinations in the Psychosis Spectrum and Comparative Information from Neurodegenerative Disorders and Eye Disease. And it says this: hallucinations and multimodalities have also been noted in individuals with severe depression and with mixed psychiatric diagnoses, as well as in non-clinical adults and adolescents. Such co-occurrences of auditory and visual hallucinations suggest a common hallucinatory mechanism which, in combination with the specific sensory dysfunctions, determines the modality of hallucinations. Now, this is what I really want you to get. It is important to note, however, that simultaneous or fused auditory and visual hallucinations are not a frequent occurrence. When you're seeing and hearing, this is
And resurrections are a frequent occurrence?
not a common occurrence. In most cases, they are experienced at different times. An auditory hallucination one day and a visual hallucination the next. Furthermore, when simultaneous auditory and visual hallucinations do occur, they are typically unrelated. And this is the example they give. And I just think it's fascinating that this is the example that they give. They say, e.g., seeing the devil while hearing the voice of a relative inside one's head. That's very interesting, isn't it?
Well, if you can see the devil and hear voices in your head, why couldn't you see an angel and hear voices in your head? Why couldn't you see Elijah and hear voices? Why couldn't you see Jesus and hear voices?
Suggesting that the mechanism for auditory and visual hallucinations in these disorders must be partly independent, though with some overlap. So, Peter's not old. He's not a woman.
He is old, 40 years old, probably 5 years from death.
For what it's worth, it's not a spouse that he's lost.
Yeah, it's probably someone he loved more, his Lord and personal Savior. That trumps a spouse.
He probably is depressed, and we have reasons to believe that he is depressed, but let's just say that he was going to experience a very rare multimodal hallucination. Even in such a very rare case, the multimodal...
Okay, when you hear Braxton Hunter use the word rare, think resurrection.
But let's just say that he was going to experience a very rare multimodal hallucination. Even in such a very rare case, the multimodal hallucination really wouldn't be multimodal in the way that we're typically used to thinking about it. These auditory and visual hallucinations happen at different times, maybe even a day apart or more. And when they do happen together, in the very, very rare case, they aren't the same perception. So like you're seeing the devil, but hearing the voice of a...
Yeah, the reason why Braxton's saying all this is because he's letting you know this is just crazy. This is nuts to think that they hallucinated this, because it says that Jesus walked and talked with them 40 days in the book of Acts after he rose from the dead. He ate with them. He supped with them. He had Thomas touch his sides. Like, this is crazy. This happened like in continuity. This wasn't just some type of vision on one day and hearing stuff on another day. He walked and talked. He lived with them. I'm going to say what I think is going on inside Braxton's brain, but this is what I think he's thinking. And I totally understand that if you think the Gospels are reliable text telling you history. But even Christians, if you're disagreeing with me right now, I think you can understand that if you do not take the Gospel narratives and Acts as reliable history, you can see how quickly this crumbles, right? You can see that.
Relative in your head, like they don't sync up. And in the very, very, very rare case when perhaps they do and a conversation can be had, this is among the older folks in the study that talked about people in their 70s. So this is, when you add all of that together, each stage makes it even more implausible that this explains what happened with Peter. Now, you might say, yeah, but
yeah, he's saying when you add up all these low probabilities that Peter would be old and that he would have visual and auditory and all these things, it multiplies and becomes even a lower probability that they hallucinated Jesus, or that Peter did at least. But the same can be said for each step of the way for those minimal facts, as Troy pointed out. All these things that you have to be confident in that actually happened.
May be very rare and ridiculously unlikely, but at least, Braxton, it's a naturalistic explanation. Well, that's fine, but we're going to show that at each stage of this, as we have been showing, at each stage of this, just like with the unmarked mass tombs and everything else, all these different things that we're talking about, that you're going to see a highly unlikely basis for each of these pieces. So that in the end, you have all of these extremely unlikely pieces having to fit together to make an even more extremely unlikely alternative hypothesis to the resurrection.
But it's still, in Braxton's mind, more likely than a resurrection. I mean, the resurrection is more likely than that. The likelihood that Joseph of Arimathea was a real person who desired to take Jesus off the cross and put him in a tomb, that all the tomb narratives from Mark through John tell a good gist of what happened. All these things combined is more, and Jesus actually rising from the dead, all these things, all these steps along the way are still more probable than one or two guys having a hallucination. And that the Gospels are mostly story.
Peter merely decided that Jesus' message of the coming kingdom was too important and that he would take...
Okay, so even though Jesus died, the message about the coming kingdom perhaps was too important. In other words, he said, you may have missed it because of the way I'm chopping this up, but he said, so maybe that stuff with the post-bereavement hallucinatory experience, or maybe Peter just, like, he knows Jesus is dead, but hey, this is so important, I'm just going to go start preaching it. In which case, either he's lying. He's either lying or what? I don't know. What's going on here? How do you explain?
Or maybe he's lying, or he's thinking that there's a greater good out of this. So what do you think it is for Joseph Smith and Muhammad, Braxton? Like, let's say they wrote down that Joseph Smith saw Jesus. Is he lying? What's more probable to you, that he's lying or he actually saw Jesus? Or is there some way he could be mistaken? Could he have an ulterior motive? How about Muhammad? Was he lying when he said that angel Gabriel talked to him in that cave? He couldn't have just made that up, could he have?
Why is this important if Jesus is dead? I mean, I'm not the first to say that, like he said, there were a lot of messiahs running around, and when your messiah kicks over, you go back to being a fisherman or you find a new messiah. So that's how that works.
Huh. But look at the growth of Islam. Look at the growth of Mormonism. Now, they didn't have a leader that was supposed to rise from the dead, but you believe that these are false religions, but yet they still kept going. Why couldn't that be the case for Christianity? Okay, the only reason I'm doing this is to show how powerful bias is, and how in the world can one be objective and say something like this. Oh, come on, that's way too small. Let's see if I can make it big enough. I'm going to read it out loud. Okay, I'll date this later, but today is November 11th. But this is Lydia McGrew on her blog, what'swrongwiththeworld.net. To the Christian God, as revealed in the Son, Jesus Christ is the ultimate value. If we don't have him, we have nothing. Like, how can you be objective about Christianity if you admit that without him, you have nothing? Until Christians get a replacement, a substitute for their belief, they're going to cling on to this for dear life because they feel they have no hope. Okay, I'm monologuing. We are therefore willing to die for him, to suffer for him. Nothing else is more important. Literally nothing. Nothing can compete with him. Nothing can take his place. If evil men choose to do evil things, yes, then even evil things to those we love, that does not change the nature and importance of our own commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ. It is absolute because that is part of what it means to be a Christian. There is no point at which one says, okay, now that's too much. This is where I get off the train. That consequence of my following Jesus is just so bad. Oh my goodness. It's just so bad that I can't possibly be expected to continue not denying him. This is the place where it all changes. If you think that ratcheting up the bad things the bad guys can do to make a difference, you fundamentally misunderstand. Okay, but like, I'm resonating with this. I can feel her emotion in this. This is why guys like Braxton Hunter and Lydia McGrew and all these Christian apologists believe what they believe. Because they believe if Christianity is false, if we don't have Jesus, we have nothing. Like, how in the world can you look at the evidence for Jesus objectively and say that? We're willing to die for him, to suffer for him. How in the world can you look at the evidence for Jesus objectively and say that? How can you say that there's literally nothing more important than Jesus? How can you look at the evidence of the Gospels and say that and be objective? I've said this before on past live streams, and I'll say it again. You have to have the ability to reject Jesus in order to look at the evidence objectively. And when I say reject Jesus, I mean, like, that's maybe too harsh. To be willing to throw it all away in order to see the evidence objectively. And from what I'm reading here from Lydia McGrew, if she does that, she's admitting she has nothing. I got an email from, I'm not sure if it's a subscriber or not. I think so. I got an email from a subscriber recently who just came out of Christianity and is not out of the closet. Sort of like it's a secret. And this person is having pretty deep conversations with their pastors, probably. And this issue came up of what if it's wrong? What if Christianity is not true? And the pastor looked at this subscriber of mine and said, if Jesus Christ is not who he said he was, I would commit suicide. A pastor said that to his... And I advise the subscriber, just back off. Just don't talk to your pastor anymore about this. Because there's a chance he's serious. It's not worth taking the risk. Okay, thank you so much, Cam. 1,000 Pine Points for finding that. I thought it was gone. I thought she deleted it. Oh, and the date on that was February 2017. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. I remember seeing it when it was hot off the press. And that's like... So, if Braxton, you're probably going to hear this. Do you feel the same way? Do you feel that if Jesus Christ didn't rise from the dead, you're nothing? Do you believe that without Christianity, there's no hope for you? And I'm not just talking about your career, how you're gonna earn money for your family. I'm talking about the deep stuff. Do you think you would lose all meaning and purpose if you left Christianity? I don't know how you'd answer those. I think he's different than Lydia, but maybe not. But this is part of the reason why I'm done talking with evangelicals, because, well, I shouldn't say that harshly. I'm not done with them, but it's like they need this so desperately. Oh, I want to bring up another thing. I don't care how long this live stream is. Let's see if I can find it. There was a tweet on Twitter today, and a Christian apologist made this comment. This is from a Christian. Evangelism works. Actually, let me get the full quote. In the last 3 weekends, I've witnessed over 200 decisions for the Lord. 150 of those were professions of faith, people stepping out from death into life. Okay, and this is the quote that this Christian said that I really noticed. Evangelism works when the gospel is being proclaimed around people who desperately need it. Who desperately need it. And this is what I said. Then to be more efficient, Christians should target the desperate. Those coming out of divorce, those coming out of bankruptcy, tragedies, death, existential angst. Also, I said, Christians should pray. Braxton Hunter, if you watch this, you should pray for me. And you should pray this, that I will become desperate. Because it seems like, according to this Christian apologist who I'm reading off Twitter, that's when Christianity works, or when people accept it. And this is exactly what Cy 10 Brugenkate said to me. When he prayed for me off stream, he prayed that my life would become tumultuous. Now, what does that say about religion? What does that say about Christianity, that those who accept it, especially those later in life, have to become desperate to believe it? You should be ashamed of yourselves if that's what it takes. I think, in my opinion, the two main reasons people become Christian, or any religion, is through indoctrination, number one, desperation, number two. Okay, I want to address, there was some questions and comments. Nathan Orman, would you do a private chat after? Maybe is my answer. I don't know. I know you've been here a while now, so you're getting some, I'm like the Chinese. I got some social credit system here. And so maybe is my answer. Email me again and I'll consider it. And then there was another guy early on in the stream I noticed, what's his name? Converse Contender. I don't know if you're still here. But I've noticed you've been name dropping my name with your different debates and stuff, saying PineCreek won't debate me. Number one, I don't like debating. Number two, I don't know you. I remember the first time you asked me, you're nobody to me. Sorry, you're nobody. I don't know you. I just don't say yes to strangers. I learned that from my parents. You say no to strangers. Thoughts on the T-Jump Slick debate? I thought Slick was very slippery and slick. My thought was, here you got a guy who's been doing this for 30, 40 years, and it's like, But I've talked to Slick myself, not on public record, and I tell you, the reason why Matt Slick believes, I think, is because of the death of his child. That impacted him greatly. In fact, Slick actually admitted that. He said that that's when he experienced Jesus. He was desperate. Yeah, Brian Dale, I have a small channel compared to guys like Apologia, and I get I get notified every time there's a comment on every video I've ever made, and I get emails, and I got Twitter, I got Facebook. When someone says, will you debate me? And I answer quickly, no. It's like, that's the default position. I will say no to anyone, especially someone I don't know. The best way to get me to talk to you is for you to produce content that I respect or behave in a manner that I respect. And I did one with Help Me Believe, what's his name? Hayden. I respect the guy. He's a young guy. I like him. And that goes in the reverse. I don't expect anybody to talk to me who doesn't respect me. My guess is Braxton Hunter doesn't respect me, so he's not going to talk to me. But Braxton Hunter, if you do see this, you are invited formally to come on my channel. I'm just like Shan and Q. I'll be nice. It's interesting, William Lane Craig in a lot of Christian circles is not even popular. Exactly, doorknob head. Poof. Oh no, I wasn't going to poof. I was going to do this. Because Yahweh would not poof me.